In September of 1918, the Allies made a succession of breakthroughs on the Palestine, Macedonian, and Western fronts. The Central Powers were crumbling, but Austria-Hungary was in an especially precarious situation. Economically and militarily exhausted, the writing was on the wall. Nationalistic tensions had already been brewing in the multicultural empire, but for Hungary, which held the unique status of a separate state, this was enough. On the 17th of October, the Hungarian cabinet declared independence. Things moved quickly from there. On the 24th, a coalition of liberal and social democratic parties left the Diet, established a makeshift parliament known as the Hungarian National Council under Count Mihai Károly, and issued an order recalling Hungarian troops from the battlefield. Austrian Emperor Karl, in his joint role as King of Hungary, considered awarding control of government to Károly, but was dissuaded by his advisors and instead nominated Károly's uncle-in-law, Gyula Andrássy the Younger, who was also appointed as foreign minister in both countries. Taken aback by this naked attempt at preserving the Union, the middle and working classes of Budapest took to the streets in what came to be known as the Aster Revolution, while a group calling itself the State of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs seized power in Croatia. Failing to grasp the seriousness of the situation, Karl attempted to install another imperial loyalist, inciting the Hungarian army to switch its allegiance to the National Council. Finally, on the 31st, Karl relented and awarded control of government to Károly. That evening, former Prime Minister Count István Tisza was assassinated, likely due to his complicity in starting the Great War. And on the 16th of November, the National Council abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the Hungarian People's Republic. While the Aster Revolution had been a success, the work of the new Republican government was far from over, and the National Council knew that. The complicity of the Tisza government in going to war hadn't just been theoretical. Károly was trying to make the case that Hungary shouldn't be punished for Austria's war, but as part of the 1867 compromise partitioning Hungary from Austria, declarations of war required the approval of both countries' parliaments. Furthermore, Hungary's neighbors had gotten lots of promises from the other Entente allies to annex Hungarian territory as the spoils of victory. The objectives of the National Council thus became to distance themselves from the royal regime as much as possible and keep the country united to mitigate the coming land grab. On the 13th of November, Hungary signed the Armistice of Belgrade, in which they agreed to withdraw their forces to this line and submit their southern territories to Allied occupation. Hungary also agreed to demobilize the armed forces to just 8 divisions, plus military police in the occupation zone, to relinquish large amounts of war materiel such as ships and trains, to release all Allied prisoners of war, and to allow Allied supervision of Hungary's communications networks. These terms were pretty harsh, but for the National Council, it could have gone a lot worse. Károly had actually initiated mass demobilization before the war's end, and in accepting these terms, he hoped to demonstrate to the Allies, and particularly U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, that the new Hungarian regime was willing to play ball in exchange for a less punitive peace that would enable the country to keep most of its territory. Károly had also hoped that the southern frontiers would be occupied by British, Italian, and French forces rather than those of land-hungry Serbia and Romania. But even if the Allies had been willing to make this concession, they couldn't have stopped a previously occupied Romania from re-entering the war at the last minute and ignoring the armistice to assert their claim on Transylvania. This, in turn, inspired aggression from the newly declared Republic of Czechoslovakia, forcing Hungary to withdraw from their northern frontiers in December. At the same time, Romanian forces advanced far beyond the armistice line under the pretext of protecting ethnic Romanians. The silence of the main Allied powers in the face of all this was deafening. Were London, Paris, and Washington not more coordinated after working so well together to end the war? By the new year, Hungary had willingly partnered up with a French mission to oversee the terms of the armistice. Yet Károly's entire job seemed to consist of confirming the loftiest goals of Hungary's enemies. In late February 1919, the newly convened Paris Peace Conference ordered the establishment of a new demarcation line in accordance with Romania's advance. To ordinary Hungarians, it seemed like the country might not survive. Romania's advances on Transylvania were particularly alarming, as it contained a large minority of Hungarians and Germans, and there was good reason to fear that their culture or political rights might not be respected under the rule of a now hostile enemy. For most Hungarians, the stakes could hardly have seemed more dire. But for Hungarian Jews, the situation was even worse. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Austria-Hungary had the distinction of being the first polity in Europe to emancipate its Jewish population, sort of. Back in 1782, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II issued the Edict of Tolerance, eliminating special legal requirements of Jews and granting them the rights to vote in local elections and hold most types of jobs. In 1788 and 1789, these rights were expanded, allowing Jews to serve in the military, hold public office, and receive titles of nobility. I say sort of because the Austrian Empire didn't exist yet. Instead, Joseph ruled over a patchwork of small states, including some like the Austrian Netherlands where the Edict of Tolerance never applied. At the same time, Jewish emancipation in the Habsburg realms only lasted a single generation. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Archconservative Chancellor Clemens von Metternich revoked Jewish emancipation along with a host of other liberal reforms. Though the Austrian Empire had since unified, law and administration remained decentralized, so the repeal of Jewish emancipation ended up being just as patchy and inconsistent as its implementation. In the German and Italian parts of the empire, the loss of Jewish political rights was little more than a formality. In Hungary, it was total. And, as in most of Italy, this disenfranchisement incentivized Hungarian Jews to take a disproportionately active role in the underground movement for Hungarian independence. When Hungary revolted against Austrian rule in 1848, Jews made up 3% of the population, but 11% of the rebel army. And while that rebellion was crushed, the largely pro-Jewish Emperor Franz Joseph elevated Jewish officers to general ranks for the first time in modern history. Even many Hungarian Jewish officers were rehabilitated and went on to serve with distinction. The loss of political rights also encouraged Hungarian Jews to move out of the countryside and into the capital, Budapest, where they gained ever more access to jobs, education, and the ideas of the Jewish Enlightenment. It's for this reason that I place Hungary to the west of the Mendelssohn line. But unlike most Western Jews, who aligned themselves with factions born from the Hamburg Temple disputes, Hungary created its own stream known as Neolog Judaism, which not only introduced aspects of Reform and Conservative Judaism, but functioned as a vessel for Jewish activism in the wider struggle for a free Hungary. The partition of Austria-Hungary in 1867 and accompanying emancipation of both countries' Jewish populations made the consequences of the Jewish-Hungarian struggle clear. By 1910, Jews comprised 5% of Hungary's population, but 30% of all high school graduates and 25% of residents in Budapest, where they made up half of all doctors, lawyers, and university students, and 70% of journalists. It was a position unparalleled in the rest of the world. Neighboring Romania could hardly have offered a starker contrast. By 1919, it was the only country left in Europe in which Jews were unemancipated, owing to a passage in the 1866 Constitution which conditioned Romanian citizenship on being Christian. Indeed, while most of Europe had expanded rights for Jews through wider liberal reforms, Romania's liberal nationalists had continued to impose new restrictions on the Jewish population, imposing severe limits on Jewish employment in most sectors of the economy, suppressing Jewish religious practice through regulations on education and business, and reserving the right to expel any Jew perceived as a threat to the regime. If ethnic Hungarians feared losing their political rights under Romanian rule, Hungarian Jews could be certain of losing theirs. Just as a century earlier, the causes of Jewish emancipation and Hungarian nationhood were one and the same. On the 31st of October 1918, at the same time as the Astor Revolution, local politicians in the Banat region proclaimed their own republic, with Jewish Social Democrat Otto Roth as its president. The Banat was one of the most diverse regions of Hungary, only Budapest could truly compare, and as such, its large Serbian and Romanian-speaking populations made it a valuable prize for Hungary's southern neighbors. But in his famous 14-point speech, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had explicitly called for self-determination among the peoples of Austria and Hungary. For a Yugoslav or Romanian nationalists, that was a clear license for invasion and annexation. But what of the self-determination of the mixed multitudes of Banat, who wished to stay part of Hungary as an autonomous canton? They thought they were being clever. They were wrong. First, support for an autonomous Banat came almost entirely from German and Hungarian speakers, who weren't the majority. Second, like Hungary itself, the Banat Republic had no capacity to defend its territorial integrity and lasted just 15 days before getting overrun by Serbia. Karolyi's government still aspired to retake control of an autonomous Banat, but was forced to admit defeat in February 1919, with Roth fleeing to Budapest soon after. In mid-March, the French mission in Budapest all but confirmed what the Paris Peace Conference had only implied, that no demarcation line was permanent. Hungarian civil administration would remain in place in the so-called neutral zone, but their future annexation was obvious, and all remaining Hungarian troops would have to withdraw to their zone of control. At this point, Karolyi conceded defeat. In his new role as president, he dissolved the existing Liberal cabinet and called on the Social Democrats to form a new coalition, which they did by joining forces with the ascendant Communist Party under a charismatic young leader named Bela Kun. Bela Kun was born Bela Kohn in 1886 and raised in Kolozsvár by a secular Jewish family headed by a fiercely patriotic father. These values clearly filtered down to young Bela, who, as a teenager, won admission to an elite Protestant high school with an essay praising poet Sándor Petőfi, who fell in battle in the failed revolution of 1848-49. From this essay, it's clear that Kohn was drawn to socialist politics from a young age, but in a way that was very culturally specific to Hungary. Like a lot of nationalistically minded citizens hailing from ethnic minorities, he nativized his name from the Hebrew Kohn to the Hungarian Kun while attending Ferenc József University. There, he became loosely associated with the local Social Democrats, but avoided direct involvement in politics, instead working as a journalist until the outbreak of the First World War. Initially a mere conscript, Kun's education placed him on track to become an officer, serving at some of the bloodiest battles of the Eastern Front until his capture by the Russians in June 1916. Imprisoned at Tomsk in Siberia, Kun found himself in the company of many other Hungarian Jews, and much like fellow Austro-Hungarian Jewish socialist POW Otto Bauer, his status as an officer entitled him to access to Allied newspapers. It was a privilege of little direct value to Kun, who spoke only Hungarian and German, but many of the men who had rallied around him did speak Allied languages and could translate the news. In so doing, Kun became increasingly conscious of the various socialist movements making gains in Allied politics. And while most high-ranking officers continued to tout the virtues of the conservative Hungarian monarchy, Kun's natural talent for public speaking made him a natural conduit to spread socialist ideas among the lower-ranking officers and eventually the enlisted men. Russia's February Revolution, which overthrew the monarchy, led to a slackening of restrictions at the camp in Tomsk, and accordingly brought Kun and company into the orbit of Russia's social democratic labor parties, both the Mensheviks and the more radical Bolsheviks. The distinction between the two wasn't really that clear until the subsequent October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks seized power in the West and freed Kun and his cronies to form what would become the Hungarian Communist Party. Only in early 1918, when POW groups of this sort became much more organized, did Bolshevik leaders begin to see their value in promoting their political program abroad, chiefly Karl Radek, soon to become secretary of the Communist International. These were, after all, socialists who wished to spread the proletarian revolution and more immediately wanted their home countries to make an immediate peace. On the other hand was Lenin, who immediately took a dim view of this brash romantic from a dying empire who nevertheless saw fit to look down on Russia. At times, Lenin even suspected Kun of being a spy. Kun gained Lenin's trust during the outbreak of Russia's civil war, taking command of a unit of foreign POWs to fight for the Red Army. But when the Great War ended and Lenin dispatched Kun and his men back to Hungary, he seemed as eager to be rid of Kun as to spread the revolution. Kun and his comrades arrived in Budapest in November 1918, where they officially established the Communist Party of Hungary and initiated a bitter propaganda campaign against their former party, the Social Democrats. During their service in the Russian Civil War, they'd scandalized the Bolsheviks by making no distinction between the agrarian socialist SRs and the far-right Black Hundreds. Any enemy of the revolution was just that. Accordingly, the party's newspaper Vörös Újság made no distinction between the late royalist Prime Minister István Tisza and the radical Jews and honorary Christians within the Karolyi government. In the weeks that followed, Kun embarked on a speaking tour of Budapest in which he attracted a large following due to his natural charisma and his condemnation of the Karolyi government as ineffectual and complacent. By far the biggest source of communist support came from military veterans, many of whom were unable to find work in a ruined economy or unable to work at all due to disabilities acquired in the war. Most of these men came from the rural peasantry, the sons of tenant farmers who had never owned land, never enjoyed the right to vote, and had no great love for Budapest. It may seem strange that the disenfranchised, nationalistic, and overwhelmingly Catholic proletariat would flock to a far-left movement led almost entirely by Protestants and Jews. But you have to understand just how desperate people were. The communists were complete outsiders, untainted by association with the Karolyi government or the royal diet. It certainly helped that Kun and most other KMP leaders weren't from Budapest, a genuine novelty for the time. Furthermore, Kun's pitch wasn't just a regurgitation of Marxist talking points. He was the same Hungarian patriot he'd always been, and he was making offers that Karolyi couldn't: to collectivize aristocratic estates, to issue bonuses for demobilized soldiers, and perhaps most importantly, to refuse any further territorial concessions. With the support of the soldiers, the trade unions steadily switched their partisan allegiance to the communists. Even some social democratic politicians began defecting. A tenants movement joined in with dreams of collectivizing apartment buildings. But the soldiers ended up being the most important part of Kun's coalition. In accordance with the Armistice of Belgrade, most of the Hungarian army had given up their guns, but they easily acquired new ones from the German forces crossing through the country as they retreated from Ukraine. This did make the party harder to control, as demonstrated on New Year's Eve 1918 when pro-communist soldiers attacked and occupied the offices of the social democratic newspaper Népszava. But it also made the party impossible for the Karolyi government to ignore. On the 21st of March, a defeated President Karolyi awarded the mandate for government to the Social Democrats under Protestant politician Sándor Görbei, at which point most of the party immediately formed a coalition with the communists and ordered Karolyi to resign. On paper, the significance of the new regime could easily be overlooked. The new cabinet was composed mostly of Social Democrats, with Görbei as prime minister and Kun as foreign minister. But in accordance with the weird first-among-equals system that would come to define communist governments, Kun became Hungary's de facto leader. In the days following its creation, the new government set a bold agenda. Domestically, the first point of order was to nationalize all public infrastructure and socialize businesses and private property. In foreign policy, the new government hoped to solidify a military alliance with Soviet Russia, as well as to repair relations with the Western Allies and prevent any further designs on Hungarian territory. Back in Paris, the Allies had been completely blindsided by the takeover and spent days arguing over what to do about it. They'd already intervened militarily in the Russian Civil War and now floated proposals to invade Hungary as well. However, on the 30th of March, the Italian government received a message from Kun stating that Hungary, in spite of its alliance with Russia, welcomed diplomatic cooperation with the Allies, prompting them to switch tactics and send a diplomatic mission to Budapest led by South African General Jan Smuts. The most pressing issue in negotiations was that of borders and the occupied territories. From the very start of his rule, Kun insisted on upholding the Armistice of Belgrade and denied any interest in restoring Hungary's pre-war borders through military force. However, the Armistice of Belgrade had made clear that the occupied territories would remain under Hungarian civil administration, which the occupying Romanians, Czechoslovaks, and Yugoslavs had refused to honor. Kun wasn't averse to giving up some territory in the future, but for the moment, all of this land was still officially Hungary. He thus suggested a Central European Peace Conference in which Hungary and its neighbors could negotiate for the final status of these territories. Smuts knew that Hungary's neighbors would never agree to that, but he did offer to restore Hungarian civil administration in the occupied territories, to end the economic blockade of Hungary, and to allow a Hungarian delegation in Paris if Hungary and Romania agreed to withdraw their troops from a neutral zone to be occupied by British, French, Italian, and American troops. Kun specified that restoring Hungarian civil administration meant implementing the Soviet government's domestic agenda, putting Romania and Czechoslovakia in the uncomfortable position of seeing a communist revolution in what they considered to be their future territory. Smuts didn't have the authority to make that concession and urged Kun's government to agree to the deal that was on the table, but they refused and Hungary returned to war. On the 15th of April, the Hungarian Red Army initiated a preemptive strike against massing Romanian forces, but it backfired, and by the month's end, the Romanians had advanced all the way to the Tisa River, which in turn tanked the popularity of the Soviet government and incited a resurgence of counter-revolutionary activity. In negotiating with Smuts, Kun had hoped that the Allies would quickly recognize his regime as Hungary's sole legitimate government. The failure of those negotiations meant that securing legitimacy would fall solely on the Communist Party itself. They would fail. On the 5th of May, a coalition of legitimists and conservative Republicans from the previous governments formed a government in exile in Romanian-occupied Arad, later fleeing to the southern city of Szeged. By this time, the Soviet government was rapidly losing support outside of Budapest. Some of the rural peasantry had always opposed the communists. Some who had supported them had done so in the misapprehension that they would restore the country's pre-war borders, and yet others had turned against the government due to the threat of famine posed by an ongoing Allied economic blockade. So under the guidance of Minister of War Tibor Samway, two separate units were established to preempt a counter-revolution by any means necessary. Meanwhile, on the 9th, the regrouped Hungarian army invaded Slovakia, successfully driving a wedge between the Czechoslovak and Romanian forces and breaking through to the pre-war northern border. On the 7th of June, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau messaged Kun, promising to invite Hungary to the peace conference if they withdrew from Slovakia, while also threatening the most extreme measures if they didn't. Kun now faced a dilemma: evacuate Slovakia and ensure the downfall of the regime through popular counter-revolution, or remain there and ensure the downfall of the regime through Allied intervention. After some stalling, Kun came up with a solution he believed would please both sides. On the 12th of June, he suddenly announced a new plan to reorganize Hungary as a multicultural federation. In a speech to the Congress of the Hungarian Communist Party, he reiterated his government's affirmation of the Paris Peace Conference's commitment to national self-determination. However, he argued that the proletarian revolution in the occupied territories had become inevitable, and that the people of these territories would seek protection from their reactionary neighbors as equal partners in a Hungarian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. 4 days later, the Slovak Soviet Republic was declared, and a week after that, the Congress of Soviets ratified a new constitution which explicitly called for regional autonomy along ethnic lines. In reality, Kun's brilliant maneuver pleased almost no one. The nuance of a federal system was lost on military revanchists like Chief of Staff Aurel Stromfeld, who resigned in protest. The rest of the cabinet was furious with Kun for taking more and more unilateral action, only ratifying his federal constitution to maintain the appearance of unity in a time of crisis. And an exasperated Lenin urged Kun to cut a deal with the Allies in Paris, who rightfully viewed the Slovak Soviet as a complete farce. Sensing a moment of weakness, the remnant Social Democratic Party launched a coup attempt on the 24th, but failed. In response, Samway authorized the Red Guard and Lenin Boys to intensify their repressions, authorizing the kidnapping, torture, and execution of any political or military figure suspected of disloyalty. Hungary's Red Terror had begun, and its death toll is estimated between 370 and 590. Following the coup attempt, the Hungarian government agreed to withdraw from Slovakia. The Slovak Soviet was dissolved on the 7th of July, and the Red Army began to collapse. This was especially bad news for the ongoing famine. See, Hungary actually produced enough food to feed its population, but because of the economic blockade imposed by the Allies, the Hungarian koruna had become worthless, leaving the peasantry with no incentive to sell their surplus produce. Kun had suggested using the Red Army to requisition the surpluses, or even to operate their own farms, but with manpower rapidly dwindling, Kun in some way instead prioritized one last offensive against Romania. It was a complete failure, and the Red Army fully disintegrated. With the collapse of communist revolutionary activity in Germany and the White armies on the rebound in Russia, all hope for the Hungarian Soviet Republic disappeared. On the evening of the 31st, Bela Kun gave a farewell speech to the Budapest Soviet and immediately fled to Vienna. Within hours of Kun's departure, Sándor Gergely summoned Social Democrat Gyula Péter to form a new government, effectively restoring the Hungarian People's Republic. The following day, former Minister of War Tibor Szamway was caught attempting to sneak into Austria and committed suicide. On the 3rd, the Romanians occupied Budapest and captured Gergely, though he escaped captivity and later settled in Vienna. Péter formed a coalition between the Social Democrats and the pre-war Liberal parties, and began taking measures to find and capture those who had participated in the Red Terror. But that would prove impossible. Just 5 days after taking power, the counter-revolutionary coalition in Szeged mounted a bloodless coup and installed a monarchist government under Romanian protection, with liberal-turned-conservative István Friedrich as prime minister. At the same time, a military government was beginning to take shape west of the Danube under Admiral Miklos Horthy. In an occupation lasting 3 months, the Romanian army looted Budapest of as much industrial equipment and transport infrastructure as possible. Finally, in mid-November, the Allies pressured Romania into leaving the city and began mediating the process of reunification. On the 16th of November, Admiral Horthy arrived in Budapest on a white horse. In an accompanying speech, he said that revolution had made Budapest an alien enemy within the Hungarian state, but that he had returned with a sense of forgiveness for the populace. The sentiment of forgiveness wasn't shared by his army. Among those who had answered his call in response to the Soviet collapse was a collection of officers from wealthy or aristocratic families who had served in the World War but had become dispossessed of their property and political privileges under the governments of both Károlyi and Kun. As Kun had his Red Guard, these men appointed themselves as the White Guard, who, in concert with a handful of far-right veterans organizations, unleashed the White Terror. Where the Red Terror was committed mostly in secret, away from prying eyes, the atrocities of the White were intended to be as visible as possible, leading officers like the infamous Pál Pronai to engage in elaborate tortures, burning their victims alive and creating lavish public displays of mutilated corpses. So too did the scale of the White Terror quickly eclipse that of the Red. Within the White Guard was a core of ultra-nationalist intellectuals who concluded that communism wasn't merely an enemy unto itself, but a natural consequence of liberal democracy, meaning that anyone whose actions or inaction could be interpreted as contrary to the natural order of aristocratic Hungarian Christian supremacy could be a target. That meant any civil servants or military personnel who had served under the Károlyi or Kun governments, any artist or academic who had maintained their careers during those governments, anyone seen as promoting secularism or trade unionism or universal voting rights, any woman suspected of taking an interest in politics, and most of all, anyone who was Jewish. Most Jews in Hungary hadn't been active supporters of the Kun dictatorship, but Kun, Samueli, and half of the outgoing Soviet cabinet had been Jewish, and for the White Guard, that was reason enough. Pronai infamously made a charm necklace from the ears of his Jewish victims, whom he and his associates publicly demonized as the root cause of democracy, feminism, capitalism, communism, Hungary's defeat in the Great War, and the decline of monarchy. Ultimately, while the Red Terror claimed between 370 and 590 lives, the White Terror claimed between 1,500 and 4,000, of which 25 to 50% were Jews, to say nothing of the tens of thousands subjected to false imprisonment, robbery, extortion, torture, maiming, and especially sexual violence. The degree to which Horthy was complicit in the terror remains hotly debated. However, it was carried out with the knowledge and tacit approval of both provisional governments, and their new political order reflected a desire to establish a purely Christian and conservative ruling class. Elections began in the west, later expanding eastward as the Romanian forces withdrew. Voting in these elections was mandatory for those eligible, but, as before the Great War, the majority of adult citizens were ineligible, and the ballot wasn't secret. In protest, the Social Democrats refused to participate and encouraged voters to spoil their ballots. It made little difference, as the election resulted in a truly overwhelming victory for the right and far right. Up to this point, the Allies had supported Horthy's efforts to restore order, but the White Terror convinced them that the country was a lost cause, at which point they blackballed Hungary and gave its neighbors everything they asked for. On the 4th of June 1920, Hungary signed the Treaty of Trianon, ceding 72% of its territory to Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Poland, and Italy. The following year, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia formed the Little Entente, an alliance created for the specific purpose of containing Hungary. Back in Budapest, Horthy restored the monarchy, though the country still lacked a monarch. Former King Karl briefly attempted to enter the country and install himself, but neither the Western powers nor the Little Entente would allow this. Ultimately, no suitable monarch was ever found, leaving Hungary as a kingdom without a king, ruled by an admiral without a navy. While most of the Jewish victims of the White Terror had been randomly selected by their killers, those who had enjoyed high-profile political positions under Karolyi were at least subjected to show trials. Former Banat leader Otto Roth was tried for treason, but, like many others, cleared of wrongdoing by Horthy. He returned to his hometown of Timișoara, now part of Romania, where the Romanian authorities arrested him for treason as well, but released him on the condition that he retire from politics. 2 years later, Romania ratified a constitution with full freedom of religion and equal rights for all ethnic groups, completing the process of Jewish emancipation in Europe. Bela Kun spent the rest of his life in the Soviet Union, working as a bureaucrat in the Communist International under Karl Radek. This isn't the last we'll see of him, but it might as well be. This is how it was always going to end. Whoever ruled Hungary faced an impossible dilemma: to appease the Allies and regain their standing on the world stage, or to appease the demands of a hungry, unemployed, and vengeful public. Each new regime came to power in the belief that both goals were achievable, and each new regime made both problems worse. The Horthy government, ruling over a vestigial pariah state, spent the next generation deflecting this uncomfortable truth by promoting two mutually incompatible myths: that Hungary bore no responsibility for the World War, and that its victory in that war had been foiled by a conspiracy of feminists and Jews. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.